just naturalism and the moral architecture of liberty, the ontology of rights, law, and authority in Cascadian constitutional thought. I. The crisis of legitimacy and the return to first principles. Every political age inherits a paradox: power is needed to secure freedom, yet power itself threatens the liberty it professes to protect. In our modern condition, this paradox has hardened into a crisis of legitimacy. Governments claim moral authority through procedural regularity rather than moral validity. Law has become a syntax of control rather than a grammar of justice. The civic order, once rooted in consent and mutual respect, has been absorbed by administrative necessity. What remains is the facade of legality without the substance of legitimacy. Against this dissolution of meaning, the Cascadian philosophy of just naturalism recalls the ancient question: whence comes the right to rule? Its answer is neither metaphysical in the theological sense nor positivist in the legalist one. It begins not from government but from the sovereignty of the person, from the moral ontology of rights that exist prior to and above all political institutions. The government of Cascadia, as conceived under the social compact of sovereign persons, is not an originator of rights but their trustee. Its legitimacy derives solely from its fidelity to natural law, the rule of right grounded in moral reason, not in command. The restoration of legitimacy therefore requires more than reform, it requires re-anchoring governance in the natural order of justice. This order is not speculative but moral and rational. It arises wherever free beings recognize in one another the equal claim to self-determination. It is this recognition, and the duties it entails, that constitutes the true foundation of law, liberty, and authority. 2. The ontology of natural rights. Natural rights are not concessions of law but conditions of personhood. They do not arise from social recognition but from the ontological structure of human will. To exist as a rational being is to possess faculties of action, powers of thought, choice, and self-direction, which are ends in themselves. These faculties, being integral to personhood, cannot be alienated without negating the very being that holds them. Thus, rights are not permissions but protections of the inherent powers of the self-determining mind. The moral logic of natural rights proceeds from moral equality and mutual non-aggression. If each person is a self-originating center of will, no one may justly subordinate another without consent. The equality of persons is therefore not numerical but structural. Each stands in identical relation to the moral law that binds all. The rule is reciprocal. As I claim sovereignty over my faculties, I must acknowledge the same sovereignty in others. From this reciprocity emerges the law of equal liberty, that every person may act freely so long as such action does not infringe the equal freedom of another. This principle, first intuited by the natural jurists and perfected in the Cascadian doctrine of moral and reciprocal autonomy, defines the moral geometry of human coexistence. It is the invisible architecture of freedom, self-limiting, self-consistent, and self-justifying. Legislative bodies may enumerate rights, but they do not create them. They merely articulate, in juridical language, what already belongs to the person by virtue of nature. A right is not born of statute but recognized through conscience. Its source is moral law, not legislative grace. Thus the Cascadian constitutional guarantees are declaratory, not constitutive. They do not bestow liberty, but defend it from invasion. 3. The nature of human sovereignty. Sovereignty, in its original sense, is not a property of states but of persons. It is the self-authorizing faculty of the will, the capacity to act as a moral cause rather than a mechanical effect. Every person is, within the boundaries of equal rights, the ultimate legislator of their own conduct. This sovereignty is neither absolute nor arbitrary. It is bounded by the same natural law that sustains it. To be sovereign is to govern oneself in accordance with reason, not impulse. The rule of right begins with self-rule. Hence the moral dignity of sovereignty lies not in the assertion of power but in the discipline of justice. When a person acts from conscience rather than coercion, they participate in the universal order of liberty. The government of Cascadia exists only as a derivative sovereignty, an agent created by the voluntary association of self-sovereign persons. Its power is delegated, not inherent. Its authority is fiduciary, not proprietorial. The moment it ceases to serve the rights from which it derives, it ceases to be legitimate. As the Cascadian axiom holds, government is trustee, not master. This conception transforms political power from command to custodianship. It dissolves the metaphysical illusion of the state as a superior entity and restores political order to its rightful place, as an instrument of moral cooperation among equals. IV. Freedom and liberty as the minimal force condition of life. Freedom, in its moral sense, is not the absence of limitation but the absence of coercion. It is the minimal force condition of life, that state in which every being may unfold according to its nature without artificial restraint. Liberty is the civil manifestation of this condition, the social equilibrium achieved when coercion is confined to preventing coercion. The freedom of one person does not end where another's begins, rather, their freedoms meet as boundaries that define one another. Each person's liberty shapes and is shaped by the liberty of others, forming an ethical topography of mutual respect. Coercion appears as the disturbance of this balance, an intrusion into another's sphere of rightful action. Thus, liberty precedes government both logically and historically. Law and authority arise only to preserve the equilibrium that liberty itself generates. Government does not define the limits of freedom, freedom defines the legitimate limits of government. This inversion of the positivist order, placing liberty before law, constitutes the moral foundation of the Cascadian system. In this sense, liberty is not a privilege contingent on social utility but the condition that makes social cooperation possible. Only free persons can consent, only consent can create legitimate law, and only law grounded in consent can yield just authority. V. The moral geometry of freedom. The structure of liberty can be described as a moral geometry, a network of equal spheres whose balance constitutes justice. Every person's autonomy radiates outward until it intersects with that of others. At each intersection arises the necessity of mutual restraint, the acknowledgement that to preserve one's own freedom one must respect the freedom of all. This is not a limitation imposed from without but a self-limitation derived from reason. The recognition of others' rights is not sacrifice but self-consistency. Freedom that violates equality destroys itself, for in denying another's sovereignty it undermines the principle that makes its own claim valid. Here lies the foundation of civil coexistence. Law, in the Cascadian conception, is the formal articulation of these natural boundaries. It translates the moral geometry of freedom into a system of objective rules, allowing disputes to be resolved not by force but by right. The equilibrium of liberty thus becomes the equilibrium of society. VI. Law as the institutional architecture of liberty. Law, rightly understood, is not the command of power but the institutional architecture of liberty. Its first purpose is restraint, not of persons, but of injustice. The law restrains coercion, adjudicates conflict, and restores balance when rights are violated. In the moral order of Cascadia, law is the guardian of autonomy, not its adversary. It is the shield that transforms moral principle into civic practice. By codifying the rule of right, it enables persons to coexist under predictable norms of conduct. The impartiality of law is not merely procedural but moral, it reflects the equal standing of all persons before reason. However, when law ceases to mirror natural justice, when it becomes the instrument of command rather than the servant of right, it degenerates into arbitrary edict. The moment legislation departs from moral logic, it loses its binding force upon conscience. Law repugnant to rights is no law. This principle is not rebellion but fidelity, to justice over legality, to moral order over bureaucratic order. It defines the ultimate safeguard of liberty, that no human enactment may override the laws written into reason and nature. 7. The decay of law and the duty of civil disobedience. When legality separates from legitimacy, obedience becomes complicity. The decay of law begins when the state claims the right to command what it cannot morally justify. This is the essence of tyranny, not merely oppression, but the inversion of authority, power without right. The Cascadian doctrine of civil disobedience arises not from anarchy but from conscience. It asserts that the citizen's highest loyalty is to justice itself, not to the transient statutes of fallible men. Civil disobedience is the reassertion of moral sovereignty in the face of institutional corruption. It is the act by which persons remind government of its derivative nature. Yet such resistance is not violent by necessity, its moral power lies in its legitimacy. When the people of Cascadia withdraw consent from laws that violate the natural person's rights, they are not destroying order but restoring it. The social compact is not a suicide pact, it is a covenant to uphold justice. When one party, the government, breaks that covenant, the other, the people, retain the natural right of redress, even to the refounding of lawful authority. 8. Order as civic equilibrium. Order, in the Cascadian sense, is not the imposed stillness of fear but the peace of moral equilibrium. True order arises not from suppression but from harmony, from the alignment of individual wills under the common rule of right. The positivist state seeks peace through obedience, the just society achieves peace through respect. Fear produces quietude, not stability, only justice produces durable order. The legitimacy of civic peace depends on the degree to which citizens perceive the law as an extension of their own conscience. Where law embodies natural justice, obedience is voluntary, where it diverges, enforcement becomes perpetual. Thus, the measure of a society's order is not the absence of conflict but the fairness of its resolution. Cascadian institutions, grounded in reciprocal autonomy, aim not to eliminate contention but to civilize it, to replace violence with judgment, vengeance with restitution, and subjugation with cooperation. In this sense, civil peace through moral reciprocity is the highest expression of political maturity, the recognition that the equilibrium of liberty is the only stable foundation of civic order. IX. Justice as the operational rule of right. Justice is the operational dimension of right, the process by which moral balance is restored when liberty is violated. It is not retribution but rectification, not domination but restoration of equality. The classical jurists define justice as to give each their due, but in the naturalist sense, what is due to each is the full enjoyment of their faculties within the equal liberty of others. When this balance is disturbed, justice acts as the corrective force of reason, re-establishing the proper relation among wills. In Cascadian jurisprudence, justice has four qualities: impartiality, proportionality, restorativity, and alignment with natural duties. Impartiality ensures that judgment is free from interest, proportionality that penalties do not exceed the moral gravity of harm, restorativity that victims regain what was lost, and alignment with natural duties that justice remains moral, not mechanical. This view contrasts sharply with the punitive traditions of command states, where justice is conflated with obedience to law. In Cascadia, law serves justice, not the reverse. The moral purpose of adjudication is to restore persons to their rightful freedom, not to vindicate the pride of institutions. Hence, the rule of right, justice as the living law of liberty, becomes the axis around which all legitimate authority must turn. Without justice, order is tyranny; without order, justice is chaos. The harmony of both is the essence of just naturalism. X. The concept of just authority. Authority, in its just form, is the moral right to command where command is necessary to prevent coercion. It is a trustee of justice, not a proprietor of persons. The government of Cascadia possesses no metaphysical superiority; its mandate is functional and conditional. The legitimacy of government arises only from fidelity to the rule of right. When it acts within this boundary, defending persons against aggression, enforcing contracts, and adjudicating disputes, it exercises just authority. When it acts beyond this boundary, legislating morality, redistributing liberty, or compelling conscience, it becomes a violator of the very rights it was created to protect. Just authority thus requires perpetual accountability to the governed. Power must flow upward from consent, not downward from decree. The people remain the final arbiters of legitimacy, for their natural sovereignty cannot be permanently alienated. This conception dissolves the false dichotomy between libertarian anarchy and authoritarian order. It establishes a constitutional equilibrium in which government exists, not as a rival to liberty, but as its guardian. As the Cascadian maxim declares, all coercion is justified only to prevent coercion. 11. The chain of dependency. In the moral architecture of Cascadian thought, every level of civic order depends on the integrity of the one below it. Rights give rise to liberty, liberty necessitates law, law sustains order, order enables justice, justice legitimizes authority. When rights are denied, liberty collapses into servitude. When liberty is suppressed, law becomes tyranny. When law is corrupted, order decays into fear. When order is maintained without justice, authority becomes despotism. And when authority loses its moral foundation, the people reclaim sovereignty by natural right. This chain of dependency is both logical and ethical. It demonstrates that political stability cannot be engineered from above; it must grow organically from the moral soil of rights and reason. Each link is both effect and cause. Law must reflect liberty as liberty reflects right, forming a circular but ascending order, the constitutional spiral of just naturalism. In this structure, government is not the root but the canopy of the civic tree. Its strength depends entirely on the vitality of the roots, natural rights and moral autonomy. To nourish those roots is the perpetual task of constitutional renewal. 12. The principle of just naturalism. Just naturalism is the moral constitutional philosophy that unites liberty, law, and justice into a coherent order of self-governing persons. It affirms that the only just government is that which conforms to natural law, moral reason, and mutual consent. Unlike divine right or legal positivism, just naturalism does not sanctify power, it sanctifies the person. It holds that all civil institutions are derivative expressions of the moral law that precedes them. It recognizes natural duties, to respect others' rights, to refrain from coercion, to restore balance when harm is done, as the reciprocal foundation of freedom. Under this doctrine, any law that violates the natural person's rights is void ab initio, for it contradicts the moral purpose for which law exists. The Constitution is not a fixed parchment but a living covenant between reason and power, perpetually tested by the conscience of the people. Cascadian governance, therefore, aspires not merely to legality but to moral legitimacy, a system where authority is always secondary to justice, and justice to liberty, and liberty to right. The perfection of such an order is not utopian but asymptotic. Society may approach it through enlightenment and vigilance, though never fully attain it. The value lies in the striving itself, the continual moral recalibration of law to the standard of reason. 13. Cascadia as a living compact of sovereign persons. The Cascadian state, conceived under this philosophy, is not an empire of subjects but a federation of sovereigns. Each citizen retains primary sovereignty over their faculties, delegating only those powers necessary for the defense of rights. The government exists as a legal personality of collective defense, exercising coercion solely to prevent coercion. Its institutions, legislative, judicial, administrative, are mechanisms of coordination, not domination. Their measure of success lies not in the extent of control but in the extent of liberty preserved. Taxation, regulation, and enforcement are justified only insofar as they serve the moral economy of rights, preventing predation and ensuring restitution. This structure transforms the relation between citizen and state into one of partnership rather than hierarchy. It replaces obedience with covenant, authority with accountability, compulsion with consent. The government's legitimacy is renewed with every act of voluntary compliance grounded in moral trust. Such a model, while demanding of civic virtue, yields the highest form of order, peace through liberty, not peace through submission. It represents the culmination of the social contract tradition, from Locke's natural equality to Jefferson's inalienable rights, refined through the modern insight that liberty must be sustained by decentralized, transparent, and participatory institutions. 14. The ethical boundaries of coercion. All coercion, even when lawful, carries moral peril. The power to compel must be justified not by outcome but by principle. The Cascadian ethic therefore constrains coercion within the narrowest possible bounds. It is justified only to prevent or redress coercion. This doctrine rejects both authoritarian paternalism and absolute license. It defines a zone of legitimate force, the defense of persons, property, and contracts, and forbids intrusion beyond it. Government may restrain the aggressor but never the innocent. It may regulate the means of action but never the moral ends of conscience. Such restraint transforms the use of force from domination to defense. It preserves the sanctity of the person while allowing collective action against injustice. Within this framework, liberty and order are not enemies but allies, each sustaining the other through moral limitation. The ethical test of any policy is thus simple: does it prevent coercion, or does it impose it? To the extent it does the latter, it violates the rule of right and forfeits legitimacy. 15. The renewal of legitimacy. Every generation must renew the social compact of Cascadia, not through ritual but through conscience. Legitimacy cannot be inherited, it must be continually earned by fidelity to natural law. The people remain the final interpreters of justice, for they alone embody the moral reality from which authority flows. When institutions forget their origin in the consent of the governed, the compact must be re-examined, amended, or replaced. This is not revolution in the destructive sense but re-evolution, the restoration of form to principle. The right to alter or abolish unjust government is not an indulgence but a duty, inscribed in the very logic of self-sovereignty. Thus, the perpetuation of liberty depends less on constitutions than on the civic virtue of the governed. No parchment can secure freedom if conscience sleeps, no power can enslave a people awake to their rights. The ultimate safeguard of justice is the living reason of the citizen. 16. The reconciliation of liberty, justice, and order. The apparent tension between liberty, justice, and order has long divided political philosophy. Libertarians fear that order will devour liberty, statists fear that liberty will dissolve order, moralists fear that justice will perish in the compromise between the two. Yet under the doctrine of just naturalism, this triad is not contradictory but concentric, each encircling and supporting the others. Liberty is the form of justice in action, justice is the logic of liberty applied to conflict, and order is the equilibrium that results when justice prevails. Liberty without justice degenerates into license, justice without liberty becomes tyranny, order without either becomes despotism. But when liberty defines the boundaries, justice maintains the balance, and order expresses the harmony, society achieves the moral unity that law alone cannot create. This unity is neither mystical nor mechanical, it is moral geometry enacted through institutions that mirror the laws of reason. In Cascadia's constitutional vision, every organ of governance is oriented toward the protection of rights, not their redistribution. The legislative power codifies the moral boundaries of liberty, the judiciary interprets them through impartial reason, the executive enforces them with minimal force. Each branch is bound by the same natural law that binds the citizen. Such a system restores to politics the humility of service. The government of Cascadia does not claim to perfect humanity, only to protect its freedom. Its moral authority is therefore self-limiting, for it recognizes that the perfection of virtue belongs to the person, not the state. The role of law is to prevent injustice, not to manufacture virtue, to keep the peace, not to script the good life. This self-restraint is not weakness but wisdom, the recognition that freedom is the only soil in which moral growth can occur. Through this equilibrium, Cascadia realizes the synthesis of liberty and order that has eluded empires and republics alike. Its social peace does not depend on conformity, but on respect, not on uniform belief, but on mutual recognition. Each person, by honoring the equal sovereignty of others, participates in the continual act of constitutional creation, the daily renewal of justice through conduct. 17. The constitutional metaphysic of Cascadia. At the deepest level, the Cascadian constitution is not merely a legal document but a moral metaphysic of governance. It translates natural law into institutional form, embedding within its structure the principle that authority must always descend from right. Its articles and sections are expressions of a single premise, that persons are the ultimate ends of law, never the means. The constitution of sovereign persons establishes a hierarchy of legitimacy not in power but in principle. It begins with the human person as the primary political unit, the self-owning mind whose consent alone legitimizes governance. From this foundation rise the layered associations of community, district, municipality, and federation, each level exercising only those powers that the lower level consents to share. This recursive sovereignty forms a fractal order, the Tao of DAOs, or the constitutional mirror of moral autonomy, where each whole reflects the freedom of its parts. In such a system, law functions as the connective tissue of rights, ensuring that liberty is coherent rather than chaotic. It institutionalizes justice without bureaucratizing morality. By anchoring its legitimacy in reason rather than decree, the Cascadian order aspires to permanence without rigidity, stability without stagnation. The Constitution's supremacy clause, that any law repugnant to rights is void ab initio, serves as its moral firewall. It binds even the highest officers to the first principles of natural law, preventing the legal normalization of injustice. Thus, Cascadian legality is a subset of moral law, not its substitute. This design elevates constitutionalism to an ethical art, the continual translation of moral truth into civic practice. It ensures that the people remain sovereign not by ritual, but by reason. 18. The moral continuum of person and polity. In the philosophy of just naturalism, the relation between the person and the polity is neither antagonistic nor assimilative, but continuous. The moral principles that govern individuals, non-aggression, reciprocity, and consent, scale upward to govern institutions. Government is therefore the moral person writ large, constrained by the same duties it enforces. This moral continuum resolves the ancient dichotomy between individualism and collectivism. The former, when untempered, isolates the person from duty, the latter, when unchecked, dissolves the person into the mass. Cascadia's model transcends both by recognizing that liberty and responsibility are two aspects of one virtue. Self-rule implies self-restraint, sovereignty entails duty. In practice, this means that the citizen's right to freedom carries a corresponding duty to respect, defend, and when necessary, reform the institutions that safeguard it. Civic participation is thus not mere privilege but moral exercise, the outward expression of inward sovereignty. Through this continual engagement, the social compact remains alive, flexible, and self-correcting. The government, in turn, must reciprocate by treating each citizen as a moral equal. It cannot coerce belief, dictate virtue, or monopolize truth. Its power begins and ends with the defense of rights. In this reciprocity lies the moral symmetry of just authority, a state neither above nor beneath the people but coextensive with their moral purpose. 19. The political ethic of restoration. Every legitimate system of law must contain within itself the means of its own correction. Restoration, not punishment, is the moral essence of justice. To restore is to re-establish the equilibrium of liberty, to return what coercion has taken, whether through crime or through governmental excess. Cascadian jurisprudence therefore privileges restorative justice over retributive justice. Punishment, when necessary, is not vengeance but moral calibration, aimed at reconciling the wrongdoer with the moral order. The measure of justice is not the severity of its penalties but the restoration of moral balance among persons. This restorative principle extends even to governance itself. When institutions err, their redemption lies not in denial but in reform, recalibrating their function to their foundational purpose. In this sense, constitutional amendment is the moral analogue of personal repentance, an act of humility before the truth of natural law. Thus, the perpetuation of justice is not static but dynamic. Each generation must engage in the continual act of moral engineering, adjusting law to the evolving understanding of right while never abandoning its timeless principles. The Constitution lives because conscience lives. XX. The moral horizon, just naturalism as civil religion. While just naturalism is not a theology, it performs a similar function to civil religion. It binds the community through shared moral reverence for truth, freedom, and justice. Its altar is reason, its sacrament is consent, its creed, that all persons are ends in themselves. This moral reverence is essential to sustain liberty, for no system of rights can survive without a culture that honors them. The decay of constitutional order begins not in parliaments but in consciences dulled by dependence. A people that ceases to believe in its own sovereignty soon consents to servitude. Hence, Cascadian education and civic culture are not merely utilitarian enterprises but moral ones. They must cultivate the intellectual independence and ethical discipline upon which liberty rests. To know one's rights is to know one's duties, to love freedom is to practice justice. Just naturalism thus becomes the moral compass of civilization, a secular faith in the dignity of reason and the sacredness of choice. It transforms politics from the management of power into the stewardship of conscience. 21. Toward a just and free republic. From these principles emerges a vision of the just republic, a political order that harmonizes personal sovereignty with public justice through lawful restraint of power. Its foundation is moral equality, its structure, mutual consent, its purpose, the defense of liberty. In such a republic, the coercive apparatus of the state is minimized to what justice requires and nothing more. Economic policy respects voluntary exchange, civil law protects contracts and persons, cultural institutions flourish in pluralism rather than uniformity. The law functions as the collective memory of moral experience, adapting to new circumstances without betraying first principles. Foreign relations under this order are guided by the same moral logic: non-aggression, mutual respect, and the sovereignty of nations as moral equals. Cascadia, governed by just naturalism, becomes not a power among powers but a principle among nations, a living demonstration that peace is not the absence of strength but the presence of justice. Such a society would not be free from conflict, for liberty implies diversity, and diversity implies disagreement. But its conflicts would be civilized by justice, and its disagreements reconciled through law. It would exemplify the highest aspiration of political philosophy: order without oppression, freedom without anarchy, authority without arrogance. 22. The moral imperative of vigilance. The endurance of liberty depends not on institutions alone but on the perpetual vigilance of conscience. The architecture of law may restrain power, but only the virtue of citizens can restrain ambition. The eternal tension between freedom and authority cannot be resolved once and for all, it must be managed daily through moral awareness. In Cascadian philosophy, this vigilance is not suspicion but stewardship. Each person, by guarding their own integrity, guards the republic. The first defense of liberty is not the constitution but the conscience, not the court, but the will that refuses to obey injustice. Hence the moral imperative: no person is bound beyond their consent. The moment law commands what reason forbids, the duty of disobedience arises. This principle is not destructive but preservative, it protects the moral continuity of society against the corruption of its institutions. Through this vigilance, the social compact remains a living covenant rather than a relic. The government remains the servant of justice, and justice the servant of liberty. The republic endures because conscience endures. 23. Conclusion: the harmonized order of just naturalism. In the final synthesis, just naturalism stands as the reconciliation of liberty and law, of rights and order, of person and polity. It affirms that moral truth is the only stable foundation of political power, and that sovereignty begins, not in institutions, but in the self-governing mind. From rights arises liberty, the sphere of moral action; from liberty, law, the institutionalization of justice; from law, order, the peace of balanced freedom; from order, justice, the continual restoration of equality; and from justice, authority, the moral right to govern. This ascending chain forms the constitution of reality itself as mirrored in the constitution of the republic. The government of Cascadia, so conceived, is a living geometry of justice, a structure both moral and practical, delicate yet enduring, grounded in the conviction that no authority is legitimate that does not serve the freedom from which it springs. Its strength lies not in domination but in restraint, its stability not in fear but in faith, in the capacity of persons to govern themselves according to reason. In this order, law and liberty cease to be adversaries and become harmonics of a single truth, that the purpose of society is not to perfect mankind but to protect the conditions under which perfection may be pursued. Justice becomes the rhythm of freedom, order its melody, liberty the very air through which both resound. Thus the Cascadian experiment renews the oldest promise of political philosophy, that peace, justice, and freedom are not incompatible ideals but interdependent realities, each sustained by the moral sovereignty of the person. In the language of its founding maxim, Cascadia stands for this enduring truth. All coercion is justified only to prevent coercion, all law derives from liberty, all authority exists for justice, and where any law violates rights, it is no law at all. This is the rule of right, the equilibrium of liberty, and the moral foundation of a just republic, a vision not only for Cascadia, but for all societies that would be free.